Today, I want to talk about critical race theory, clarify what it is, and explain why I think the church should embrace it. Now, the first thing that I want to say about critical race theory is that it is a method of critically examining the structures of society as they relate to race. It is not an ideology. Many of its critics use a straw man argument and disregard critical race theory by telling you that it teaches this or that controversial position. And while that may be true for some individual scholars, though the critics of critical race theory never seem to cite any sources for their claim, but by rejecting just these individual positions from different scholars, they have actually failed to understand what critical race theory is in its essence. So I want to reiterate this point. Critical race theory is a critical and scholarly method, or we could say that it is a field of study. It is not an ideology. It does share a set of assumptions about the nature of power relations in society, particularly as they relate to race, and thus it is a sociological discipline in that regard and relies on that basic foundation. But it is important for us to realize as we begin that critical race theory is not a set of ideas. It is not a set of conclusions, though there are certainly a variety of scholars that use critical race theory to lead to certain conclusions. But at the end of the day, critical race theory should be thought of as a method and as a field of study. And so many of its critics just miss the mark entirely because they misunderstand this very basic point. Now, furthermore, critical race theory is also a form of critical theory, which is another academic discipline that focuses on the power structures at the social and political level, specifically aiming to reveal those structures and most often challenging them at the same time. Now, classically, critical theories have revolved around a class-based relation, but critical race theory just shifts the focus to a more race-based form of analysis. Now, another point to clarify is that critical race theory does not subvert everything to race. In fact, several of the major scholars working with critical race theory have pioneered what's known as intersectionality, which goes beyond just one form of identity, whether that's race, class, gender, sexuality, etc. And so I've heard that said by some of the critics of the theory that it subjects everything under the rubric of race, but that's just simply not the case. It is aiming to understand things on a race-based perspective, but that doesn't mean that it's not more nuanced and able to see the interconnectivity of individual identities. And so the point that I want to stress here is that both critical race theory and critical theories in general are forms of social analysis. They are fields of study, and thus they are not ideologies. And that is an important point to remember whenever you hear someone criticizing or complaining about critical race theory. Typically they do so by listing a bunch of things that are controversial that certain scholars maybe have tried to claim with critical race theory, but that in itself is not what critical race theory is about. And so they are trying to disregard an entire field of study, not necessarily just the positions of some of the scholars have held. And so it is important to make that distinction between some of the conclusions that scholars have reached and the actual field of study itself called critical race theory. Because they're not the same. And so by propping up critical race theory to be something it isn't, its critics are engaging in a fear-mongering tactic. They want you to judge critical race theory based on some of its hardline conclusions, when in reality it is more accurate to call it a field of study or a methodology from which certain conclusions are then derived. It is at its core academic and thus based on a study and examination, not on ideology. But its critics often treat it as an ideology, not a methodology. But that is typically the point of strawman arguments. They are used to distract the fact that the commentator who's criticizing the theory has no real interest in presenting you with a fair understanding of what it is, and they're not certainly engaging in any sort of good faith argument. Rather, they're more interested in a kind of gotcha moment where they present something that sounds absurd and extreme and then claim that that is what the theory teaches. But this gotcha sense of look how bad this is and look how wrong this is just fear-mongering, and it's a tactic that we should be very skeptical of. But I want to repeat myself just so that I am perfectly clear here. Critical race theory describes an academic field of study. Rejecting it wholesale would be like rejecting the study of plants because you find it somehow morally objectionable to examine the life cycle of roses. It's just an absurd thing to do. And so if you want to disagree with some of the claims that are being made by particular critical race theorists, then that's perfectly fine. That's what you do in an academic field of study. These sorts of studies are always subject to peer review and critique. But you then have to actually engage in the evidence and arguments that are being presented by those theorists. But that's not what's being done when I've seen people rejecting critical race theory. Instead, they disregard the entire field of study without actually talking about its central claims. But ultimately, that is a dishonest and misleading form of engagement. Now, one of the proponents of the theory defines it quite clearly and helpfully, writing, "Critical race theory is a practice. It's an approach to grappling with a history of white supremacy that rejects the belief that what's in the past is in the past, and that the laws and systems that grow from that past are detached from it." Now, as a field of study, critical race theory has many variations, so it is often hard to pin down exactly what the theory entails, although there are a few guiding principles that seem to link its proponents together. One such proposal is that white supremacy is present in America and that it exists on more than just a personal individual level. Rather, racism is institutionalized through the legal and economic structures of society. So critical race theory looks at a statistic like the fact that American prisons are disproportionately full of Black and Hispanic individuals, and it asks, why? What has led to that result? Or it asks why Black Americans are killed by police at such a disproportionate level. And so it is asking questions about society based on the reality of racial discrimination. It is looking for the systemic reasons for that bias. And it ultimately refuses to accept any sort of racist victim blaming, such as those who claim that Black people are just inherently predisposed to criminality and that that's why they fill our prisons. That is clearly a racist claim, and critical race theory has no place for it. Instead, it aims for a deeper and more realistic analysis by studying the laws and policies that are in place which lead to the racial disparity in prisons and policing. So once again, critical race theory is a method of analyzing the power structures of society from a race-based perspective. But to offer some historical context here, I want to go back and compare critical race theory to the civil rights movement. One of the central claims of the theory is that the civil rights movement did not end racism in America. Now, of course, the civil rights movement was important, but its work was left mostly unfinished. And in many ways, critical race theory is a continuation of that project and finds its roots in many of its leaders. Even Martin Luther King Jr. acknowledged the fact that simply passing the Civil Rights Bill would not be enough. Towards the end of his life, he became quite explicitly radical in his ambitions, especially in his campaigns for the poor and his protests against the Vietnam War. Now, King is an important figure for us to re-examine. He's often propped up as a kind of mouthpiece for conservatives, but the reality is he was a radical socialist who firmly believed that racism in America will not and cannot be overcome until its economic systems of oppression are also overcome, namely the injustices of capitalism. The common white narrative about the civil rights movement is that it fixed all of the issues with racism in this country, but that is very far from the truth. America is not a post-racial society. So critical race theory is a progression from the civil rights movement, and it recaptures the more radical elements of that movement. Those radical insights have been overlooked or intentionally downplayed by white liberals, and critical race theory rejects how the history of Black struggles has often been whitewashed. Another example to illustrate this point is to consider how schools often teach the legacy of Malcolm X and Martin Luther King Jr. And Malcolm X is often seen as a radical, violent extremist, almost a terrorist. When I grew up, that was kind of the impression that I was led to believe about Malcolm X. But then Dr. King was lifted up as a great preacher of love and kindness who believed goodness and decency would win the war against racism. But this is a false narrative. Anyone who has actually studied these figures will know that King is often far more radical than he has been portrayed, and Malcolm X was actually much closer to King than it is often thought. Personally, I actually really enjoy Malcolm X's speeches, and I highly recommend giving them a listen. He was an excellent speaker. He was very intelligent in the way he spoke as well. There's this great book by James Cone that compares the legacy of Malcolm X and Martin Luther King Jr. that I highly recommend, and I'll put a link to it below in the description. But the point I'm trying to make here is that the civil rights movement has been whitewashed and de-radicalized. The result is this mistaken idea that racism is no longer an issue in America. Or to be more precise, I should say that the misimpression is that racism is no longer a legal issue in America. This presents the wrong idea that racism is now only a personal issue and not a social or political one. It shifts the blame onto individual racists and wrongly gives the impression that the legal and economic system as a whole is not itself a part of the problem, if not the root problem. It is assumed that the systems and laws of a country are neutral, but this is the very myth that critical race theory has shown to be false. By examining the power structures that exist in society, critical race theory aims to reveal structural racism and challenge it wherever it is found. Thus, racism is more than just personal bias. It is a systemic problem at the very heart of America's legal system. Now, racism as a term must be precisely defined here, because one of the critiques against critical race theory is that it is in itself somehow a racist idea dividing America by color. One of the assumptions is that anyone who critically examines the realities of racial disparity is trying to divide people by their race, and thus that such a theory itself is racist. But this is absurd. It would be like blaming a doctor for being the one to tell you that you have cancer. The problem is cancer, not the one who studied your body to reveal its existence. Rejecting critical race theory as a field of study because you dislike some of its results would be the same as rejecting the study of medicine because you have been given a hard-to-hear diagnosis. The problem we should focus on instead is institutional racism, not the critical tool that reveals it and challenges it. But critics of critical race theory have focused on this method of study rather than the errors that it has revealed. And I suspect that all of this is ultimately more of a distraction tactic than anything else. And that is exactly why critical race theory is skeptical of any claims to neutrality or colorblindness. Because in a society that is systemically organized at the benefit of one race and the detriment of another, it is impossible to be neutral or colorblind. And again, let me be clear, the statement that white supremacy privileges white people at the expense of black people is not a baseless opinion, but the conclusion of detailed study. And it is that kind of analysis that critical race theory is all about. So people will say things like this: I am the least racist person you've ever met. But that is to fundamentally misunderstand how racism operates in the modern world. Racists never think they're racist. And that is because they live under this idea that neutrality and colorblindness exempts them from the structures of white supremacy. But there is a festering wound at the very heart of society, and to ignore it would be pathological. And so this distinction between personal racism and systemic racism is one that we have to keep in mind when we think about the importance of critical race theory. We cannot excuse ourselves on a personal level from any of the systemic problems. We are all part of this society, and as such, we should feel some responsibility to the way that our institutions discriminate against certain races and certain economic classes and certain genders. These should concern all of us. And so you may not feel personally like you are a racist individual, but you may still benefit from some degree of racism, or from sexism or from classism. And so there's an element of personal responsibility even at the systemic level. And critical race theory is a helpful tool of analyzing those structures. Now, Abraham X. Kendi has shown in his work and research that individual racism is actually often a symptom of institutional racism, and that when institutional racism is abolished, individual racism often goes along with it. So by disregarding critical race theory, the political right is essentially saying that they do not want a critical analysis of systemic structures and how they affect race. They don't really care if our laws are not, in fact, colorblind. if they actually disadvantage some people over others. Or, for example, they do not care if de facto segregation is still a reality, even if it is no longer legal, which is something that's been shown by many studies. But you should start asking yourself why. Why do these conservative critics so wildly make critical race theory into a boogeyman and reject its very premise outright? You would think that if racism could be studied in an academic manner, and if it could be shown that it is a systemic issue still written into the very laws and institutions of our country, you would think that that would be something they would be interested in learning. But perhaps they react so violently to the methodology of critical race theory because they already know that this is the case. And moreover, they benefit from those very structures. Perhaps it is because they like the way society is organized and find that it suits their priorities and needs. So be wary of anyone telling you that the real racists are the ones fighting for justice. Be wary of anyone who tells you that the status quo is perfectly fine, especially if those same people benefit from the status quo. Now, to speak personally and bluntly for a moment, I must confess that I benefit from white supremacy. I have benefited from it my entire life. This is an insight that was made clear to me as I studied the work of Black scholars and activists who in one way or another implement a form of critical race theory. They show by their research that by being born white, I was more likely to go to a better funded school, to live in a more affluent neighborhood, and to have a greater inheritance from my family. I am also much less likely to be thrown in prison or to be killed by the police. And these are just the most obvious benefits of being white in a white supremacist society. There are also the more subtle forms of racism that Black people and other minorities face on a daily basis. White people are often slow to recognize the realities of racism because they often benefit from them. That is something critical race theory reveals and challenges. The point is not to make white people feel guilty, but to instill a sense of responsibility. This country belongs to all of us. And if its systems and policies are designed to limit opportunities or stunt the possibilities of some group of people at the benefit of others, then every American should be outraged, and we should work together to fix the injustices of this system. That is what true patriotism is, by the way. A true patriot loves their country enough to criticize it, even to criticize their own position in it. So we must reckon with the realities revealed by critical race theory, that racism is still deeply embedded in our society, and we must open our eyes to it. Critical race theory in itself, though, is a tool that can help us see these things and then to help us create a better tomorrow. It is not an ideology, but it is a tool for detailed study and analysis. Of course, that analysis leads to some hard conclusions that are hard to hear. But that doesn't mean that the theory itself should be disregarded just because you don't like the results. Again, we can refer back to the doctor analogy. Just because the doctor told you that you have cancer doesn't mean you should reject the field of medicine. So it is with critical race theory. So I understand that it can be hard to hear some of the conclusions that critical race theory reveals, but that is no reason to reject the method that led to those conclusions completely. Now, of course, on an academic level, we can raise questions about the particular author of a study. We can look at the methodology more carefully. But to reject the entire field of study that tries to analyze the power structures in society and how they relate to race, I think that's just naive and absurd. We should be open to any sort of critical analysis that can lead to a better understanding of the world, particularly if it means that it can lead to a liberation of oppressed and disadvantaged people. And so as Christians, we must be on the side of justice and liberty. We must be a voice for the voiceless and stand up for the least of these. And thus we should listen to critical race theory, not because it has all the answers, but because we cannot afford to miss God's heart for radical justice. And so as a tool for analyzing the means of oppression in the world today, critical race theory is invaluable and should be embraced. And critical race theory is not an ideology, as I've stressed over and over again, And I know that many in the church fear that as an ideology it may some way conflict with the gospel, but it is a methodological tool that can help us better proclaim the gospel in the world today. It has no conflict with the gospel. In fact, it has a congruency with it because it can help us proclaim more clearly liberty to the oppressed. We cannot afford to let the status quo go unchallenged, especially not when it acts violently towards the black, the poor, and other minorities. The church has often called for peace in these situations, but as Jürgen Moltmann reminds us, peace is not the absence of conflict, but the presence of justice. So to be peacemakers in the world today is not to call for superficial reconciliation. It means to be agents of justice, to fight for the least of these, and to critically analyze the systems of oppression and work to overcome them. It is one thing to care about racism, but it is another thing to ask why it still exists. It is enough to care about the effects of racism, but we should also ask what sort of institutions propagate racism. And all of those questions will lead to social analysis. So until the day when there is true racial justice in America, until systemic racism is no more, there will remain a need for critical modes of analysis that get to the heart of our social ills. So ultimately, I pray that we move beyond these silly boogeyman games. Don't be afraid of critical race theory. Don't listen to the fear-mongering tactics. We have much to learn from it still today. So thank you so much for watching this video. Check out the recommended reading list that I've included in the description below. And also let me know if you have any questions. I understand that this topic can be controversial and it can be difficult for a lot of people to think about, especially when the default tends to be offended by certain statements. And so I just pray that you would come towards this with a patient and a critical mode of thought, and that you would be able to try to understand the heart of what this theory is about. But I also open to questions, and so please leave any questions that you might have about this, because I think it's important. I think it's important for us to engage in a more fruitful dialogue with what critical race theory is, and avoid some of this boogeyman tendencies where you just set up a straw man argument to just knock down critical race theory. So I think it's too important of a field of study to just ignore. And so, yeah, thank you again for watching, and I hope this was helpful.